Good morning, everyone, and reiterate thank yous for organising this and inviting us all to come and share our ideas and perspectives on perspective taking. So I'm going to give you a run through of some of the work that my lab have done over the last, feels like 5 years, it's probably more like 10, on perspective taking. A lot of this is stuff that has been published, and then I'm going to try at the end to move into talking about how this may link into work that we're doing now. Okay. So I'm going to be talking a lot about so-called implicit mentalising. I actually thought François might give us a bit of a definitions, but I'm going to quickly do it here. So what do we mean by mentalising? Well, it's broadly defined as the ability to represent in one's own mind the mental states of another person's mind, and that might include their intentions, their thoughts, and their knowledge. And of course, we've got a range of terms, which is problematic, and Thorsten already mentioned the jingle jangle issue. So we may be calling this theory of mind reading, mentalising, representation of mental states, and perspective taking, I'm going to argue is a component in this process. But it's obviously problematic that sometimes we're talking about visual spatial perspective taking, sometimes thinking about others' emotions, sometimes cognitive perspective taking, which some people do call the same as theory of mind. So again, I think I'm going to try and come back to that. But obviously the assumption that we do represent other people's minds has got really important implications for things like criminal justice, where we have to think about the intentions underlying an action and not just what someone's done. We've already talked about clinical conditions, but of education as well. You need to represent what someone else knows or doesn't know in order to be an effective educator. So the question that's occupied quite a few of us in this room over the last decades is whether mental states are something that we represent always explicitly, consciously, deliberatively thinking about someone else's mental state, or whether that the explicit is obviously on the right hand end. We think that this tends to happen, develop around 3 or 4 perhaps, the explicit ability to talk about the contents of someone else's mind as being different from the contents of my own mind. But is it possible, or is it the case that mental states can be represented without language before childhood, in infancy, and maybe also in non-human primates and even in non-human animals? So what the studies I'm going to be talking about today boil down to is looking at these kinds of effects, particularly in the domain of visual perspective taking, and considering whether any of these so-called implicit mentalising effects do really reflect the result of mentalising, thinking about someone else's mental states, or alternatively, can we explain these effects as the result of alternative non-mentalising processes? So this is the classic implicit perspective taking task, because it's kind of key evidence for so-called implicit mentalising, which is of course from Dana's lab. And so I am going to talk through it because this is going to form the basis of most of the studies I'm going to talk about. So in this task, you are faced with image as a participant. You see an image of an avatar, and the avatar can see some dots, and you can also see some dots. And in some cases, your perspective and that of the avatar are consistent. You can see 1 dot, she can see 1 dot. But in other cases, your perspectives, your visual perspectives, are inconsistent. You can see 2 dots, but she can only see 1. The dependent variable is generally the response time to answer a very simple question, which is, how many dots can you see? And the crucial evidence for implicit visual perspective taking is the fact that when when I'm judging how many dots I myself can see, I'm slower to do that when my visual perspective is inconsistent with that of the avatar. So when I can see 2 dots, but the avatar can only see 1, that slows me down. I respond more slowly to say that I can see 2 dots, compared to the condition where myself and the avatar can see the same number of dots. That's what we're calling the self condition here. That's the crucial condition for evidence that we might, as participants, be implicitly taking the other person's visual perspective. Often this task is combined with trials where you're asked the other person's perspective, how many dots can she see, and you also get an interference effect there. That's evidence that when considering the other person's perspective, one's own visual perspective interferes. So that's an egocentric effect. But the one we really want to focus on as evidence that you're representing the other person's mind is this one, the self effect here. So that's the kind of key behavioural result. And as I alluded to, in our lab, we've been testing and looking at alternative accounts of these data. And the classic paper is Celia Hayes' Submentalising paper nearly a decade ago now. But this account suggests that, well, yes, we can get these reaction time effects, very robust effects, but perhaps those reaction times effects don't reflect real mentalizing, implicit, automatic taking of the perspective of the other person. Is it possible that other processes are explaining these results? So what we did, this is with the Damas Esteban, is we ran exactly the same task as I just showed you, but we replaced on half of the trials, the avatar was replaced with an arrow. Now the arrow cannot see dots, it doesn't have mental states, it doesn't have a visual perspective. But what we found on those crucial self trials is that you can find exactly the same response time impact of seeing an arrow. When I have to judge how many dots I can see, I'll be slower here than I will here, because the arrow is pointing at a different number of dots from the number of dots that I can see. So we can generate the same reaction time differences with an agent that arguably doesn't have a visual perspective. And so we're very unlikely to say that those on the right-hand side, that response time difference is coming from some implicit representation of what the arrow can see. So what was the next step in this kind of journey was a study by Galonetto from Cristina Becchio's lab. And what they did is replaced or added to the dot perspective taking task an avatar who was wearing goggles. A bit difficult, sorry, to see in this image, but the avatar's goggles are either opaque, so the avatar can't see through the goggles, or they're transparent. And then the third condition there is just the control condition where the avatar has no goggles on at all. And what Galonetto and colleagues showed was that they found that visual consistency effect, so slower response times on inconsistent trials when I'm judging how many dots I can see, and that's a different number from that the avatar is facing. And they found that only in the case where the avatar was wearing transparent goggles, but not opaque goggles. So they said, okay, this is evidence that the participants are able to represent the avatar's visual perspective, the fact that it's not just directional, it's not just how many dots there are in front of the avatar versus behind her, which is, you know, an argument that obviously could be leveled at this task as a result of the arrow data. But it can't just be directional, because they found this effect as a function of whether the avatar was wearing transparent or opaque goggles. However, in that study, as I mentioned before, there are some trials in the task where you take your own perspective, and there's some where you're instructed to take the other's perspective. And in that study, those trials were interleaved, meaning that perhaps participants, because they're being asked to look very carefully at whether the avatar's wearing opaque or transparent goggles in order to take on the other trials where you have to say how many dots can the avatar see, then maybe that that focus on what the avatar can and can't see on the avatar perspective trials is carrying over onto the self-perspective trials. And so what Jane Conway did in the 2017 paper is replicated the Felanetta study, but just blocking the trials so that participants answered all of the self-perspective trials before they encountered any of the other perspective trials. And in that study, we couldn't replicate the finding, if anything. So you can see this is the size now, this is not the raw reaction times, it's the size of the consistency effect. So the difference in response time between inconsistent and consistent trials. And if anything, that was greater on the trials where the avatar was reportedly wearing opaque goggles. So we don't see evidence that the participants are taking into account what the avatar can see in this setup. So in the same paper, what Jane Conway went on to do was kind of go a step further beyond this goggles study, and what we considered is that if participants have perhaps repeatedly experienced opaqueness, barriers in front of one's sight, you learn, this is obviously quite a behaviourist account, but these are the types of accounts that we're trying to test. Participants learn that when barriers are placed between another person and an object, the person acts as though they cannot see the object. So that's a behaviourist account of why people don't interact with things that they cannot see. As an observer, I've learnt that when there's a barrier, people act in a way that's consistent with them not being able to see the things on the other side of the barrier. So to rule out in that case, barrier accounts or barrier manipulations in the dot perspective task are perhaps not the best way of testing whether one is really representing what the other can see, because we could be seeing these results because they are representing what the other person would do if they could interact with those objects. This was all a bit of an excuse really to do some cool stuff with physics. So what Jane Conway did was manipulated what is seen using an invisible telescope. So the idea is, instead of having opaque and transparent goggles, we have two types of telescope that make use of different focal distances, such that it's a little bit hard to see. I'm not sure if you can see just about 3/4 of the way between those first two lenses. There's a tiny spot where, in the focal distance of this telescope, anything presented at that point is invisible, and depending on the focal distance, you can make that you can create telescopes where one is invisible and the other isn't. And this is a genuine physics effect. We created these telescopes. Jane set up a little room in the lab where we had the blue dots on acetates that were at the right distance to be within this invisibility cloak of the telescopes. And so participants were able to experience for themselves the visible telescope through which they could see the dots and the invisible one through which they couldn't. And so this just extends that goggles logic to the situation where the agent is always viewing the scene through transparent telescope, but one of them renders the object invisible. So after participants had experienced the telescopes, they then went and did the dot perspective task again, but this time the avatar had either the visible or the invisible telescope in front of her on different trials. And then these are the results again. These are just from self trials. And so the critical finding is really that for the avatar, and for the arrow, there's no difference in the size of the consistency effect as a function of whether the avatar is looking through a visible or an invisible telescope. Right, so all of those studies together are suggesting that we can generate this consistency effect, this classic difference in response times, through arrows, whether or not the agent that should have a mental state or whose visual perspective we are meant to be representing, whether or not they can or can't see with goggles, and whether or not the thing that they're looking at is or isn't visible to them, in this case with the telescope. But that doesn't necessarily mean, what that means is that we can generate response time effects that look the same for an arrow as for an avatar, that look the same when they are wearing opaque goggles as when they are not, and look the same when they're looking through invisible versus visible telescopes. Well, that doesn't tell us that this effect, just this one here, isn't coming from implicit mentalising, implicit representation of the other person's visual perspective. Arguably, it's very hard to do that with response times. We could get the same response times from lots of different routes. So what I'm going to look at now is a study by Schertz and colleagues where they said, okay, well, let's look at the neural basis of this. So very similar design. You've got arrows, you've got avatars. They've either got consistent or inconsistent trials in terms of how many dots the participant versus the agent can see. And what Schertz and colleagues were interested in was particular regions of interest that they took from meta-analyses of visual perspective taking and theory of mind tasks. And what they said in this paper is that they found consistency effects, so differences in brain response as a function of whether the number of dots the participant could see was the same or different from the number that the agent can see. And they said that these were specific to the avatar in these areas: right temporal parietal junction, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and ventral precuneus, all of which were key areas in these previous meta-analyses. So if this is the case, they argued, then this would be evidence that these behavioral effects that we found in our data might be coming from different neural routes. A mentalising specific one when you're looking at the avatar, and some other kind of route when you're looking at the arrow. But arguably, when we went through this paper carefully, the statistics didn't really support this. So while they claimed that there were these differences, they weren't. What you really want to see is an animacy, avatar versus arrow, by consistency, consistent, inconsistent interaction. Ideally on the self-only trials, the trials where I as participant am judging how many dots I myself can see. And those didn't come out of any of the data that was presented in that paper, which is a bit of a picky point, but to me it was crucial. That was the statistical result that would need to support those claims. But actually, I think I'd like to move to a more important logical point, which is, if there are brain areas that are specific for ascribing mental states, in this case visual perspectives, to others, then those areas should be responding. We should see a bold response in those areas, regardless of whether I am looking at the same number of dots as that other agent. So regardless of consistency. So in a sense, I think the analyses they're doing were not appropriate for the dependent variable, which is the response in the brain when I am looking at someone else who has a visual perspective. To take this another step further, then, if implicit mentalising, this automatic representation of someone else's mental state, if that's meant to happen whenever I see an agent who has mental states, who has visual perspectives, then it should be happening on consistent trials and inconsistent trials. It should happen all the time. But if it really is happening all the time, then arguably with brain imaging, it's impossible to separate out the processing of an agent that can have mentalistic states, visual perspectives, from the fact that the only way that we can present an agent that does and doesn't have mentalistic states is to have some kind of perceptual difference. And then in the end, what all you end up with is the fact that we process human bodies in different brain areas from non-biological stimuli. So it's going to be very hard to get brain imaging to tell us whether there are indeed different neural routes generating these consistency effects for mentalistic versus non-mentalistic stimuli. So something that we thought might help to resolve this is brain stimulation. And with brain stimulation, we can target particular areas of the brain that we think might be involved in particular cognitive processes and try and disrupt the functioning very briefly in those areas of the brain. So in this study with Adama Santiesteban, we stimulated two areas, the right temporal parietal junction, which is a theory of mind, an area implicated in theory of mind, but also implicated in more domain general attention shifting. Everybody's aware of that debate. So that's the area of the brain that we stimulated and expected to see an effect if this area is involved in the cognitive functions that we're measuring in this task. We also had a mid-occipital, MOC means mid-occipital control site just at the back of the brain there. That's our control site. We don't expect that to be impacting on performance. Same task as before. We've got avatars and arrows. We've got implicit, we've got consistent and inconsistent trials. And we're going to measure response times to judge both self and other perspectives while participants are doing this task, either while they're being stimulated over the mid-occipital site on every child or over the temporal parietal junction on every child. So if the temporal parietal junction is involved in producing the consistency effect, then the size of the consistency effect should change when we're stimulating the temporal parietal junction. And if Schertz and colleagues are right and it's only generating it for the avatar, then we should see that as an interaction with the animacy of the stimulus as well. So this is, I think that's on just self trials, which are the crucial trials. We don't. Essentially, we see the consistency effect, but no differences of the function of where we're stimulating, no differences of the function of whether it's the avatar or the arrow that's being presented. If, however, the TPJ, temporal parietal junction, is involved in attentional processes, so this is the domain general account of TPJ function, if it's involved in attentional processes that are only required on some types of trial, then we should see an impact of temporal parietal junction stimulation only on those types of trial. And the attentional processes we were considering in terms of this particular task were attentional pop out and reorienting. So on consistent trials, so those are the top here, the dots tend to be clustered on one side of the avatar or the arrow, whereas on inconsistent trials they tend to be spread out. So there's a kind of reorienting. If you have to judge, work this through, not just the difference between consistent and inconsistent trials, but the difference between self and other trials. When you have to judge your own perspective, you get this kind of pop out effect, the dots kind of pop out at you, and then you've got to reorient towards the ones, you've got to kind of cluster them all together for the self, whereas when you've got to judge the other perspective, you need to use the central avatar or arrow as the cue to direct your attention, and then just focus on the dots on that side of the screen. So there are some very basic attentional processes going on that are going to be the same for avatar and arrow, but different as a function of whether it's a self trial or other trial. So that's what we did find an effective brain stimulation as a function of which perspective people were taking. So when they were having to take their own perspective, mid-occipital, in this figure, sorry, it's wrong colours from the brain picture, but in this figure, mid-occipital, the control site is in white. People are faster generally to take their own perspective than the perspective of the avatar or the arrow, but that benefit is reduced when stimulating temporal parietal junctions. So the TPJ seems to be supporting some of these domain general attentional processes that are used on self trials to kind of probably to integrate those dots that have popped out across the whole screen, as opposed to just paying attention to one side of the screen or the other. Okay.
Sorry, can you non-self meaning other perspective, or it's also mixed with something else?
No, so it's non-self, it's other perspective, which we don't call other because the arrow isn't an other person, but so non-self means arrow and avatar.
Can I just ask, so why would you predict that it was integration rather than separation? So for because I mean, it depends a little on your focal distance, but from here, the sort of, I mean, you see a bunch of dots and you can see them in one saccade, right?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
And so there are two possible things that you might have to do. One is separating them out in order to make another judgment, for example, and another is to integrate two different things in order to make a self-judgment. It's not obvious. I mean, a priori, is it obvious which of those two things TPJ stimulation might disrupt?
I think you're right. It is about focal distance, and when you are only that far from the screen, we hypothesised that it would be that more than the reorienting, reintegrating across the screen. Also, because you get the cue before you see the image, you get the cue as to whether you're self or other, whose perspective you've got to take. So if it says his, and then you see the image, you already know that the first thing you need to do is look at the centre of the screen and look at which way is he looking. And it's similarly, if it says arrow, you've got to do the same. The first thing you've got to do is look at the centre and look at which way. Whereas when it's self, you know that what you've got to do is kind of take that step back, as it were, take that wider perspective across all the dots. So that's why we felt that those are very definitely attentional processes that differ across those self and other trials. And as you can see, we found no evidence that they differed as a function of consistency or animacy, but yes, evidence that whatever the TPJ is doing seems to be affecting that domain general attentional process, whatever that might be. All right. So to run through then the data that I've shown you on the dot perspective task, we know this is a key task that supported claims of so-called implicit mentalising, implicit visual perspective taking. Hayes proposed this submentalising account, saying that you might get these effects from non-mentalistic processes. We've got behavioural data that support that. I think there are logical problems with the brain imaging data, and that perhaps I can show you with the brain stimulation data some support for a more domain general role of this particular brain area, the right TPJ, in this particular task. Now, have I got time to talk about another task, or do you want me to move on? I'm happy to do either, because we have 2 days. So
I don't think we have time for.
That's fine. So you're gonna see what I have to show you. So a different task, more brain stimulation.
Yeah, let's not make class too angry.
Perfect. Glad I skipped through. So then all I'm going to say to wrap up is I have hopefully shown you, at least with the dot perspective taking task, that behavioural performance can be explained by non-mentalising accounts, and that there are brain stimulation data supporting more domain general accounts of performance on these tasks. But then that takes us right back to the first thing I said, which is, well, what do we mean by perspective taking? I've focused on visual spatial perspective taking, which is representing what somebody else can see from their viewpoint. It's arguably not a propositional attitude. So the classic definition of what is mental state representation comes from Alan Leslie, which is that it's meta-representation of propositional attitudes, which is horrible. What that means is, I think that you believe that something is the case, that there is a particular state of the world. In the classic Sally Ann's ask, that I think that Sally believes that her ball is in her basket. And arguably, visual spatial perspective isn't a propositional attitude. So maybe we shouldn't expect it to be related to mental states and to brain areas involved in explicitly thinking about other people's mental states. So do other types of perspective taking fulfill that criterion better? Is cognitive perspective taking a process that contributes to representing other people's mental states rather than being the content itself of that representation? But this is kind of what I guess I'd like to be talking to people about in the next 48 hours. And then just to finally explain how this fits with what we're currently doing. So we're thinking much more about mental state representation. We've been inspired by, in the face processing literature, the idea that faces are processed as points in a multi-dimensional psychological space. And we said, well, maybe this is what we're doing for minds. So the idea is that when I encounter a new mind, a new person, I might start to place them along various dimensions in again, another psychological dimensional space. Those dimensions might relate to personality traits. We think a lot about personality traits as being dimensional, but it might be things like behavioral tendencies, how reckless or careful somebody is, and cognitive abilities as well. And they're important things to represent, because I think I'm interacting with somebody who might struggle with their cognitive ability. I might need to change the way that I talk to them to help to us to interact appropriately. So this is the theoretical framework we're working with, and so we're particularly interested in how accurate people are, at how good a mapper or a representation they have of how minds can differ along all these different dimensions, and then how good people are at locating new minds in that dimensional space, and then how good they are at inferring people's mental states once they've located the mind in that space. And I think some of these processes are things that hopefully we're going to be talking about in the next 2 days as well. So hopefully I can contribute to some of that. Thank you very much.
Time for some short questions. We had some questions. Klaus, no, nothing about the directive.
Well, implicitly, because I'm just interested in your conclusion that perspective taking is not a proposition, or doesn't result in a proposition or representation, which, funnily enough, with an explicit perspective taking task, is obviously after lunch, we reach the same conclusion.
Oh, interesting. I meant that for implicit.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I'm interested. How can you reach that conclusion from implicit perspective taking? You know, so basically, I say like perspective taking is not propositional, because it could just be that it's implicit processes don't reach that level of representation. So and also the directed task is not an explicit perspective taking; it's also still implicit. So how can you although it might be correct, basically, how could you make that jump?
I wasn't putting that forward as a conclusion that follows from those data. It was more me thinking, well, what is in the context of this meeting, if I'm saying that these tasks aren't or may not be indexing perspective taking, what do I actually have to bring? Well, it was more of a theoretical point about whether the content of visual perspective is even something that we should be thinking of in the same type of thing as a mental state, as in Leslie's definition. So yeah, interesting to see what you conclude this afternoon.
I had a question about submentalizing, and is your sense that it's just a weird feature of the way we set these tasks up, or is it that it's sort of something that probably lots of us are doing all the time that gets us information that most of the time is right, but is firing off and not giving us useful stuff sometimes as well?
Yeah, I think definitely the first.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that, you know, we're as cognitive psychologists, we're really good at coming up with these weird lab tasks that we need to then really make sure when we do come up with these tasks, for very good reason, we need to be able to kind of have a multiple trials so that we can get a really good estimate of reaction time and all of these things. But when we do that, we've really got to make sure that what we then say we're measuring is the thing we're measuring. And I think the supplementalizing account often is saying sometimes that's not what we're measuring. The second part, I think it's an open question still then, whether in visual perspective taking in the wild, we actually are using domain general non-mentalizing specific processes to do that. Perhaps probably we are. If those domain general attentional processes can do the job, why would we need to use specialized processes? But I'm not sure we have an answer to that because of the constraints of lab tasks and not necessarily having a task that we are really 100% confident is measuring this very specific so mentalizing process that we're all interested in.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.